Welcome back to the Gospel of Mark. I am now going to walk through a number of different themes that are prominent in the Gospel of Mark, and I think that these will give you a better feel for what type of message Mark is trying to convey about Jesus, as he selects a number of different episodes in the life of Jesus and brings them to the fore. All of them have important connections. There's also some very interesting movements and different messages that are layered one on top of the other throughout the Gospel of Mark. I'm not going to mention all of them. That's up to you to perhaps identify and discern and apply to your own meditation, to your own heart, to your own decisions. First and foremost, as I mentioned before, there are some Exodus motifs that show up quite frequently in the Gospel of Mark. For example, the wilderness sojourning in the prologue. There's also two feeding stories in the Gospel of Mark. Also, the term for the sea is used for the Sea of Galilee and during the crossings, the back and forth crossings across the Sea of Galilee. But these terms for the sea as well evoke memories of the crossing of the Jordan. Beyond that, there's also the Mount of Transfiguration episode. There's a cloud there. There's a mention of dwellings. Same thing. That was part of the Exodus sojourn, the ascent to Mount Sinai to receive the two tablets with the commandments. There's also a number of references to Moses, which would of course, kindle memories and remembrances of the Exodus. And also notice there's some very interesting combinations in the prologue of a number of verses from the Old Testament. For example, it combines Isaiah 40 verse 3 with Malachi 3 verse 1. And even Exodus 23:20 are there in the opening verses. Isaiah is weaved into Mark's prologue. The acclamation, for example, of the Son, that brings Isaiah 42 verse 1 and Mark 1:11 together. Jesus assumes this role of the Son, right? He is assuming this role of the Son as Israel. He's literally carrying the destiny of his people. He's walking with them. And he's walking, especially when you regard the walk in the wilderness, he is in many ways retracing the steps of his people. He is going out to where they were, being tested as they were, but with a different outcome. And that's an important thing to remember, right? All of us are walking a path at times that are walking very similar paths as those who came before us, both in the faith and even in our families. That may or may not have been all that faith-centered in whatever confession that may have been, Christian or otherwise. But we are in many ways still walking in the paths that they have laid for us. So we are called, just as Jesus was, to take up the same thing. The dreams and aspirations and goals and even sins of the people, just as Jesus did when he went out into the wilderness. He had to retrace their steps, undergo the same tests, but then with a different outcome, right? To resist the idolatries, the other false promises, and in many ways false salvations that were offered to them as a way out, as a way of coping. Instead, Jesus meets those same challenges in a different way. So that's important to remember. Now, there's the same thing, right, in Mark 4, verse 10 to 12. It's presented again as that there's going to be comfort is coming in the end of the exile of God's people. God is going to return to his people who have been exiled. So as we know in Isaiah, Isaiah proclaims the return of a messenger with good news. Malachi 3, 1 through 3. I mentioned Malachi 3 before. That makes clear that the coming of the Lord also will mean judgment. It will mean a cleansing. It will mean a bringing to light a number of things that had not been made obvious. This disappointment, right, will follow this return. priests and people were going to be rebuked. All of that is mentioned there in Malachi 3. And then finally, Exodus 23:21 through 31. Prepare the way for the Lord. Be ready for it. There's a number, of course, of blessings and curses that are brought up from verse 25 to 33. These things are laying in the background. You say kind of the biblical and theological and spiritual background of the Gospel of Mark. Now, there's a threefold geographical progression in the Gospel of Mark. Geographical expression. There's a sort of return from Galilee that I think is supposed to represent this exile. Then there's a journey along the way, right? People are following Jesus. Jesus is, right, he's paving this way out of exile and into a new life. And then finally, it's supposed to result in God's enthronement in Jerusalem. But all of these are again themes that are associated with Jesus when he is in certain places, in certain locations, and there'll be more detailed information about that when we discuss it in our actual session in January. But there are a lot of other very powerful images in the Gospel of Mark. The heavens are torn apart, for example. Schizomenus, right, in verse 1 and chapter 1, verse 10. The curtain temples are torn. So in this case, Isaiah 63, 15 to 64, verse 4 come into play. Again, Mark weaves a lot of Isaiah's work into his to show that this is something that was prophetic. It was a movement that was shaking the world up. It was causing people to rethink their convictions and their commitments. And there's a breathless pace to the Gospel of Mark. You may think I'm on a breathless pace doing this video, but there was a breathless pace. The words "time is fulfilled," 1 verse 15, immediately, euthys, right? That term immediately is used no less than 11 times just in the first chapter of Mark. It's supposed to convey that Jesus is moving at quite a pace, at a dynamic pace. He's moving purposefully, and he's making things happen. That does not mean that he was in a hurry necessarily, that he was frantic, or that he was desperate in the sense of being almost out of control. It means that he knew what he was going after, and he knew how to go after it. Lastly, this gospel is also constructed to lead us to grasp the immense power and in many ways even strangeness of our confession of faith in the crucified Son of God. That is a strange confession to make. Even the title of the Son of God is given its distinctive meaning by the confession. In really many ways, the only correct one occurs at the end of the Gospel of Mark, and it's a Gentile in 15 verse 31 as he looks up to Jesus. But confessing, that is being asked, "Who do you think that I am?" And answering with the confession is a very, very important task. Not just, of course, because it's a verbal affirmation, but it also conveys where you're placing your commitment, and how it is that you're going to avoid the idolatries of the world. The Son of God can only be known as the Son of God when he is crucified. It's in his crucifixion and in the way that he was crucified, everything that led up to his crucifixion, and the way that he behaves and the way that he acts when he's being crucified, that reveals him as the Son of God, and really reveals where the other people are truly at. So there are a number of two ways of dividing the Gospel of Mark. The first half, from chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 8 verse 26, are concerned with a number of different tasks. One is the identity and authority of Jesus. Both of these are being established in the first half of the Gospel of Mark. That's a central concern. You see it right off the bat, not just towards the second half or the end of chapter 1, but even into chapter 2 as well. So of course, once you get to chapter 8 verse 29, what's the question? "But who do you say that I am?" That's what is directed right at the reader. You're reading it off of the pages, but it's also directed at the reader. The first verse, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. From the very beginning, it's saying that this is good news. The word, of course, evangelion, was a term for proclamations of deeds, of kind of almost salvific deeds, right, works of salvation by a Roman emperor. But here it's at the very beginning of this writing, or would have perhaps maybe considered an obscure writing in Roman elite circles. It's using the same word that was used then to proclaim the works of a benefactor, primarily the Roman emperor. Right, even on some of the coins, you would see the word pax and securitas, peace and security. These were all kind of good news of what the emperor brought to the people of the empire. Well, here the good news is now being presented as something from Jesus the Messiah, in many ways in competition with the Roman emperor. So his deeds of power and healing are pervasive in the first half of the Gospel of Mark. Just go ahead and read it and you see them. This beginning suggests that there's a triumphant ending. That I think that's what the Gentiles are looking for. They think this man is amazing. He is going to end with a terrific triumph, just like any of the other Hellenistic wonder workers they may have read about or heard about. But as you start reading through the Gospel of Mark, you notice that there's this tremendous amount of incomprehension among the disciples. They just don't quite understand. And this is exactly how we, especially when I first read the Gospel of Mark, and I still do, that's how readers identify with the disciples. They don't know what is going on sometimes. They don't quite understand what Jesus is doing, or even just the sheer magnitude of what Jesus is trying to accomplish and what he's doing with them and with his own actions. So it's interesting that they're exhorted and called to receive forgiveness and then live more faithfully. It also helps us to really understand what power is about. Right? What happens when we know Jesus simply as a worker of miracles? What happens when that's the only way we seem to understand him? But he has another attitude towards the power wielders of his age. Jesus understands power in a very different way. And this crisis in understanding power really hits its peak in Mark 8. So go ahead and read that and perhaps dwell on it. Now, once you get to the second half of the Gospel of Mark, his mighty works, for some reason, seem to cease altogether. The mighty works are restrained in some way. Jesus refuses to be known as somebody who's just simply, a purveyor of power. He's displaying power. He's showing it. He also needs to be known as the Son of Man who surrenders his power in death. And in doing that, he overcomes worldly obsessions, worldly power, worldly clinging to control. And we're called to follow that way of rejecting worldly power and worldly sense of control. That's evident in Mark 8, verse 31, Mark 9, verse 31, and Mark 10, verse 32. You can actually, in that very easy progression, Mark 8, Mark 9, Mark 10, be able to remember each of the times that Jesus has to reassert his destiny in Jerusalem, and the disciples do not seem to comprehend it. But these are, I think, the kind of basic themes. There's others that are sometimes they're sandwiched into specific chapters or even passages within chapters that I haven't mentioned here, but these are some of the most important ones to remember. I hope this helps with your reading and your appreciation of the power of this writing. Have a great day.